Going to talk about an old fellow that I knew. I knew him from the time that I could walk and talk. This fellow was an outfitter, a hunter, had quite an operation in this part of Wyoming. His name was Al Davis. Now, Al ran an outfitting business out of a ranch here in the valley, Cross Sabres Ranch, and he had a backcountry, remote wilderness hunting camp in the thoroughfare on a creek called Mountain Creek. Now, early on, once a year, my granddad would guide an elk hunt for him. Now, this was around about a 27-mile horseback ride into some remote country, all day horseback ride, somewhere around 10, 11 hours or more, and in some absolutely outstanding country. And I knew these things, I understood these things because he was around considerably close to the family. And my granddad would guide a single elk hunt. That time an elk hunt was a week long, and he limited his hunts to about 4 hunters, and they only took about three or four trips into that country of a year. So there wasn't a tremendous amount of people going in there. Kept it fairly limited. Had a very, very good camp in an excellent location. A lot of grazing for all the horses, one thing another. And almost every time that my granddad had come out of that country, he'd come home with a severe migraine headache. Sometimes in bed for a few days, sometimes a full week. Try to tough out this migraine headache. I guess it had to do something with the altitude and the exertion and everything else in that country. But anyway, Al guided a lot of notable people that were fairly well off, outfitted these folks for anything they wanted to hunt. Deer, elk, moose, sheep, black bear, grizzly bear. Grizzly bear was one of his specialties, sheep. But Al could find game almost like nobody else. He had an uncanny ability to find game almost wherever and anywhere. And I was around 13 years old, or 14, and it was in September, sometime in September. We were back where we lived, and we had our old work truck, old T-bone, and we were cutting down dead fir trees for firewood. Big trees, I'm talking about big trees, 100-foot tall trees, and one thing another. And an old road that went back of our places so we could access these things, and we were working around there, and I walked up kind of to the road there as we were going to snake one of these trees up close to the winch truck. And I look up and I see somebody riding our direction down the trail. and it was Al. And whenever you saw Al anywhere, he always had a big grin on his face. And he had a hunter with him, a sheep hunter with him. And the guy's name was Pete Marco. And on one of the pack horses, was a huge monster set of sheep horns. It'd been up in the high country back of where we lived in a day and age when there was just absolutely huge rams that lived in that country. And this was a huge, huge ram, maybe the very biggest ram that may have ever, over time, been brought out of that country. And, the horses that they're riding, Al rode a big sorrel horse, and the horses were kind of nicked up here and there and one thing and another. Well, they'd rode in some very rough country, through a lot of down timber and one thing and another, got out on the top of the mesas in that country and located this great big ram. And in the process of things, they led these horses down onto a glacier, onto a big snow glacier, and they kind of slipped and slid and fell and tumbled down, and all got up alive. And this is kind of how things went going in the mountains with Mountain Man Al. He was pretty wild, pretty reckless, and one thing and another. But I can't remember in all the years that I've traveled all this country and one thing and another, I don't know as though I ever saw a bigger ram brought out of any of this country since that time. And I've seen a lot of rams. I've seen a lot of rams in this country, traveling this country, hunting this country, rams that are wintering and one thing and another. But anyway, that's just one thing about Al. And as time grew on, Al was a pretty close friend to all of us. And as he got a little bit older, he had numerous heart attacks in the mountains guiding hunters, and he wouldn't even get off of his horse. He'd know he was having an attack, and he'd just tough it out, and he'd just keep right on going. This is how tough Al was. And, he came to me quite a number of years ago, it's been at least 37, 38 years ago, I believe, and said he had an antelope permit, or a couple of antelope permits for an area, and wanted me to come along. So I and our oldest boy Flint, we went with Al hunting, and we got into some pretty private country. He had access through, the ranch, got into some pretty private country, and we had the whole countryside all back in that day and age all to ourselves. And Al killed a nice buck antelope, nice young eating buck antelope, about a 14-inch antelope, and we were right, alongside the pickup, dressing this antelope out, and the sweat was just rolling off Al's forehead. And I told Al, I said, "You better sit down." He said, "Yeah," he says, "I've got to sit down." He says, "I'm having an attack, And for a lot of years, he carried nitroglycerin with him. And he took some nitroglycerin, and it took us a while to dress that antelope all out and take care of it. And I drove his pickup because I wouldn't allow him to drive. But he just basically kind of got over it, and that nitroglycerin gave him the ability to be able to go, and from that time on, he had access into some country to hunt country that was going through private property and one thing and another, and he had a contact to be able to get into that country. And he said, he said, you've got an elk permit and I've got an elk permit, and I'd like you to go along and help me because I can't do all this by myself anymore. It's just too much. And well, we did this a number of years. Year after year, we'd go in that country and we'd get an elk and drive into that country, and we'd find a group of elk someplace, herd of elk. And anyway, Al's very last elk hunt, was in that country. And I'm surprised that, that particular day, he did do a fair amount of work. He just wouldn't have it any other way, and he wanted to do what he could do. But that was Al's last elk hunt. And over the various different times that we went hunting together and one thing and another, he talked about these situations that happened, while he was in the mountains, while he was hunting, and almost all these things to do with heart attacks were all connected to, while he was hunting and one thing and another. And he told me that as near as he knew, that at that point in time, when he'd had that heart attack the day that we were antelope hunting, he told me that he thought that was his 24th heart attack that he'd had over time. He was tough. He was really, really tough. And he had quite a wonderful nature and everything else. And, he knew how to take care of all these folks that he took into these remote camps and one thing and another. And at one time, he guided Roy Rogers on a number of hunts. Roy Rogers and Jimmy Doolittle and another fellow by the name of Wayne Ewing. I met all of them, and at that time I was about 15 years old when this went on. They hunted a grizzly, a big grizzly back in about 20-some miles back in, all off the highway in that country for about 12 days. And anyway, Roy Rogers finally killed this great big monstrous grizzly. And it was somewhere close to a 9-foot bear, which is a monstrous bear, probably somewhere around, close to around 900 pounds. And there was a fellow that was working on the outfit that did the horse wrangling and kind of kept track of the horses and did some of the camp work around there and see that there was all the firewood that needed. Al always had a cook with him, a fellow by the name of Paul Thompson, an old bachelor, which was a lifelong friend. And anyway, this fellow that did the all the camp work and everything else, he told me about that hunting of that grizzly. And Roy tried to get a big pan after they killed that grizzly, because he wanted to cut steaks off the hind quarter of this grizzly, and he wanted a pan that he could marinate that bear meat in and have the cook wouldn't have anything to do with it. But anyway, when the cook was out doing something else, he snuck into the cook tent and got a pan, and so he could marinate that bear meat in some Cutty Sark Scotch whiskey. And I don't know, they cooked it, the guys actually cooked it out on an open fire Paul wouldn't have anything to do with having that damn bear meat in the tent, cooking it, you know. And it was kind of a kind of a crazy thing. And these guys were all pretty big tippers of whiskey and one thing another. You know, they could drink the whole crowd right under the table, you know, and it was really a big deal. And as a matter of fact, when Al got all prepared to go in the mountains, he was short of horses, and he come and got a bunch of horses from us for pack horses to be able to pack everything in the mountains. And the main reason was they were packing just many cases of whiskey in the mountains for this 10-day hunting trip. And they got those horses and they went in the mountains, and late the next afternoon I heard something, and I looked up, and all those horses, they'd traveled about 14 miles back to our place, you know, following the highway. You could hear their hooves pounding on the bridge coming across the river into our place. Those horses had got fed up with that outfit and didn't want anything more to do with it, and they just cut out and come home. But anyway, you know, that's just kind of part of it. Another part is that, you know, Roy Rogers, he was fishing the stream, and there's, you know, some of those streams just full of some brook trout and one thing and another, and he was bringing in them 6-8 inch brook trout, and as soon as he got it off the hook, he was eating them raw.
Ugh.
Roy was eating these brook trout raw, you know, and he'd just take that brook trout and eat it raw, and he'd throw his line in, and he'd get another one, and he'd eat another one. But anyway, you know, there's been an awful lot of experiences in my lifetime, you know, to do with a lot of these things. And those are one of the things that stand out considerably, you know. Al had a heart attack, and he was a veteran, and you know, he'd been in the service for a short while, and he was in Billings in the hospital with this heart attack, and they had him hooked up to the heart machine, the cardiogram, you know, and they were monitoring him just 24 hours a day. He'd been there for about 3 days, and I mean, it was all right there. Al could see how everything was running, you know, with this machine running. And one of the nurses come in and asked Al. He says, "Would you like a smoke?" He says, "I'd really like a smoke." Now, Al was a smoker too, you know. And anyway, this woman saw that he got a cigarette, and he took about 3 or 4 puffs on that cigarette, and looking at that needle on that, you know, the graph on that electrocardiogram, and it just went nuts when he started, you know, smoking a cigarette. That broke Al of smoking cigarettes, but probably way too late, because he'd been smoking by that time by probably 50 some odd years, or 60 years, or maybe, you know. And he just smashed that cigarette out, and he never ever had another one. And Al was telling me this story, you know, on one of our elk hunts, and so he got done telling that story, and I said to Al, I said, "Well, you know," I said, did anybody ever figure out what to do to break you of that whiskey?" And he took his right hand and he slapped his knee. He says, "Nope." He says, "They never figured out how to break me of that." Anyway,
Wife Maisie.
this is what makes life so wonderful, just besides the hunting, is knowing some of these people. Somebody like this, that, involved with those things. That was his whole life, what he did, and then he enjoyed. And he loved to trap. He was a good trapper, and one thing another, from a very early age, when I was even 5, 6 years old and older, they'd get all set to go in the mountains for the whole fall season, and the ranch was only about 8 miles, from us, and we'd know when they were going to pack these horses up, and they had a great big kind of a shelter there by the tack room, and they'd lead these horses up in that shelter there, and they'd pack them one by one. It took about 4 or 5 guys all day long to pack. When they went in the mountains, there'd be a string of about 75 head of horses going in the mountains, and a lot of these horses weren't, but hardly green broke. Some of these horses, they had to put a blindfold on them, and to even be able to get a pack on them. Some of them would just throw an absolute fit and buck and twist and turn, and sometimes throw the complete pack off, and it was a all-day affair packing those half broke or hardly broke horses, some of them, and all the time, that this was going on, almost everybody in the crowd would have to have a snort, whiskey, but it was I just loved, because we kept track of when they were going to go in the mountains. I just loved to see all this episode, doing all these things, packing all these animals. Yeah, there was a lot of horses that were plumb easy to pack and whatnot, but there were some that were pretty green. But by the time they got done going in the mountains, and Al and some of the other guys packing them, they pretty well got simmered down and got broke to the operation, But anyway, that's one of the great memories that I have of this old timer doing these things. And Al was in his early 80s somewhere when an attack took him, and anyway, and he was in the hospital at the time.
Oh, he was at the eye doctor's.
Anyway, he lasted a few hours, and then it just finally just took him.